business. Now, the story of an ill-fated mail boat which met its untimely end at the turn of the century.
I'd always been fascinated by the wreck ever since I started reading about it in the books. The photographs of the ship was just beautiful. It was the history of the ship, the people that were on it. It's of an age which really fascinated me. And I just sort of got a love for the ship, really. It became an obsession of mine to find it. It was just an incredible sight as the ship started to loom up out of the gloom. But it was hard to sort of figure out what it looked like because it was so sharp, the bow, as I actually came at it. But as it got closer, you could see the whole ship just sort of sitting there. Unbelievable sight for a ship of that age to be in such good condition. It was just mind-blowing. It just sat on the side of the ship and looked at it, where normally you'd be all over it. I just couldn't believe, a ship of that age would be in such good condition.
Where the sea and the business conducted upon it are concerned, the Channel Islands are a close-knit community. 150 years ago, the islands were very much self-sufficient, but with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, travel by rail and the development of steam-driven ships opened up new horizons for Britain's civilian population. The growing speed, comfort and reliability afforded to travellers through the immense power of iron and steam was to be the beginning of a new era in Channel Island life. An era that was to change their rural atmosphere and parochial way of life forever. Sadly, however, the speed, comfort and technical development advertised by shipping companies in the closing years of the 19th century did not include an equally rapid advance in navigation. Radar was half a century away. Satellite navigation, not even a dream. And that very basic communication system, Morse, was still missing from the bridge, let alone ship-to-shore radio beacons and echo sounders. All the aids we take for granted were simply not available to sea captains at the end of the 19th century. Their ships were powerful, and the masters of those early steam vessels were placed in the unenviable position of having to tread the fine line between commercial success for their employers and the safety of their ships, passengers and crews. On Thursday, March the 30th, Maunday Thursday, 1899, the London and South Western Railway Company ran their first daylight mailboat of the season from Southampton to Guernsey and Jersey. On this Thursday, the duty boat was the Stella, under the command of Captain William Reeks. The boat train left Waterloo with 110 passengers and arrived at Southampton just after 11 a.m. A further 37 passengers joined along the line or at the dock. It was a fine sunny day and there was a holiday mood among the passengers. Many were travelling to the island for Easter, and a good number were islanders going home for the holiday. The Stella left her berth at number 4 dock at 11:25 a.m, 10 minutes late, and under a clear sky made her way down the Solent past Cowes and Yarmouth, and at 12:45 dropped the Needles astern and began the 64-mile crossing to the Casquets. Aboard the Stella were the great-grandmother, uncle and father of Peter Arnold.
Well, my grandfather, old Benning Arnold, had a shop in Baker Street in London, and this wasn't a very good place for his son Benning. Certainly Guernsey was a much better place for a young lad, for his summer holidays in particular. And his mother, who was one of the Morans, or Morants as they called themselves in those days, her father had a business in the High Street in Guernsey, and they had a little offshoot in Alderney called London House, and it's still called London House. And they used to come over to Guernsey quite frequently. An unusual event, I think, to go across at Easter time, but for some reason or other they decided to go in Easter, for the Easter holidays in 1899.
The sea was calm. There was a slight swell, and a light but very chilly breeze was blowing from the southwest. The Stella ploughed her way towards the western tip of the Casquets Reef. There has been a light on the Casquets Reef since 1726, although the first was merely a coal-fire light kept bright with the use of bellows. In 1790, 3 lighthouses were built on the Casquets with a system of revolving lamps. A severe storm in 1823 inflicted considerable damage, and in the year 1877, 2 of the 3 lights were demolished, leaving a single, improved lighthouse to provide safe passage for the very busy shipping lanes. Notorious though the reef is, the light in its different forms has provided safe passage for millions of tons of shipping over the last 2.5 centuries. But despite its position 113 feet above high water and its million-candle-power beam flashing 3 times every 30 seconds, the light is useless in the event of fog. The Stella was under the command of Captain William Reeks. His background as a seaman was first class. He joined the London and South Western Railway Company as an able seaman in 1874, and subsequently achieved the rank of second officer, then chief officer and acting master in 1891. He had command of the Alma and the Columbia on the Le Havre service, and since 1891 had been on the Channel Islands run. He held pilot certificates for Guernsey, Jersey and Southampton. Captain Reeks' current command, the Stella, was one of 3 sister ships built for London and South Western Railways in 1890. The Frederica and the Lydia were her companions on the Channel Islands route. The Stella was built by J&G Thompson of Glasgow. She was launched in October 1890 and made her maiden voyage from Southampton to the islands on the 6th of November. She was 253 feet in length, 35 feet in the beam and 15 feet deep, with a gross tonnage of 1,058 tons. Her twin screws were driven by 2 sets of triple expansion engines, and her top speed was in excess of 18 knots. She cost £61,925 to build. The Stella was schooner rigged, very long in the forecastle, and she possessed the elegant yacht-shaped stern characteristics of so many Victorian steamships. She had an open bridge. Her single funnel was painted cream, and she was fitted with the latest of technological wonders, electric light. Her crew numbered 43. With Chief Officer Richard Wade on the bridge and the Stella's sharp bow cutting a course southwest to quarter west at 18.5 knots in bright sunny conditions, Captain Reeks went to the saloon at 1 p.m. to have his lunch with the passengers. Between 2:45 and 3, a haze began to creep over the sky. The horizon ahead disappeared, and wisps of fog began to drift past at sea level. Shortly afterwards, the Stella entered a thick bank of white sea mist. Captain Reeks, now back on the bridge, ordered half speed ahead, and the Stella slowed to 12 knots, sounding her steam whistle at regular intervals. After about 10 minutes, the mist lifted slightly, and the captain ordered a return to full speed. The master of the Stella had two means of checking his progress during the crossing between the Needles and the Casquets: the patent log, a spinning device placed in the water at the Needles, which gave the distance travelled through the water, and the ringing up system. As an agreed number of engine revolutions was completed, the chief engineer would ring up to the bridge and continue to do so at regular intervals throughout the crossing. Each ring up told Reeks that he'd covered a particular distance through the water. Neither navigation aid was sufficiently accurate to prevent the Stella from steaming headlong into oblivion. At about 3:30, the fog thickened considerably and visibility dropped to 200 or 300 yards. Captain Reeks sent able seaman Hartop into the bow, both as lookout and to listen, because he estimated the Stella's position at some 40 minutes away from the Casquets, and the lighthouse foghorn would give him plenty of time to establish his position. On the bridge with Captain Reeks was able seaman Johnson, helmsman, First Officer Richard Wade, and Second Officer George Reynolds. The Stella, her steam whistle still blowing, continued at full speed. At 3:55, the chief engineer rang up another interval. It must have been apparent to Reeks that he was closing very fast with the reef, and yet neither he nor the other officers on the open bridge, nor able seaman Hartop standing in the chains, had heard the foghorn. At 4 p.m, three things happened simultaneously. Reeks heard, and the sound must have made the hair stand on his neck, a foghorn blast of immense power from directly above his head. Hartop in the bow shouted, "Stop her!" and ran back along the deck, covering his head with his forearm. And at the same moment, the men on the bridge and the handful of passengers on the deck saw, as though a door had opened, an immense rock loom out of the fog 100 yards dead ahead, towering over the ship. The Stella had no chance. At full speed, she needed at least a quarter of a mile in which to stop. In the event, she was within 12 seconds of destruction. She drove, all 1,059 tons, at almost 20 miles an hour over a submerged reef, scraping her length along the base of the Casquets rocks as she went. Her engines were knocked from their bed plates as she charged over the reef. Passengers were flung from their cabin bunks, and within seconds of striking, the engine room was ankle-deep in water, and the Stella began to settle by the stern. She had only minutes to live. Of the officers on the bridge, only George Reynolds was to survive. He described an air of curious calm. Captain Reeks said, rather than shouted, "Stand by to lower the boats. Women and children first, and then the men." 4 of the Stella's boats were launched, containing mostly women and children, but with some men and crew members. There were ample life jackets on board, over 700 in fact. And there was little panic, though things might have been different had the passengers realized just how quickly the Stella was sinking. Stewardess Mary Rogers gave up her seat in a boat and her life jacket to a woman passenger under her charge, and in doing so, gave up her life. Today there's a fountain overlooking the River Solent dedicated to her selfless act of courage and devotion to duty. Passengers now began jumping over the rail. Others found planks and pushed off from the stern deck. The air temperature was in the low 40s and the water was bitterly cold. A fifth lifeboat was already in the water, with a crowd of women and a few men waiting on deck, ready to board it. And it was at this moment that the Stella began her final plunge. It's true to say that had she remained afloat for just a few more minutes, the final death toll of 77 lives may well have been halved. To have launched and filled 4 lifeboats in such a short time showed remarkable seamanship. But the Stella was mortally wounded. Her bow lifted high into the swirling fog, and amid gouts of escaping air, falling wreckage and terrified human flotsam, she disappeared. Her master, wedged in a corner of the bridge, raised an arm above his head and died with her. Reeks had miscalculated on 2 counts. He was too far to the east of his intended course and too far ahead, some 3 or 4 miles, or 12 to 15 minutes steaming time. He took his miscalculations to the bottom of the sea with him, and the inquiry, which subsequently followed, had to do the best it could with the facts that were available. 14-year-old Benning Arnold saw his mother and brother Claude for the last time on the ever-steepening deck of the Stella.
My grandmother, and he would have been my uncle, I suppose. I had never thought of him as my uncle. My father's younger brother, they were both drowned, but quite extraordinarily, my father was saved, and as they always say, by a football. Somebody had a football on the deck, and he had it tied to his coat lapel and managed to hang on to this thing, which I suppose lifted him off the deck. And he hit his head on something in the rigging and somehow managed to get up to the surface without losing consciousness, and then survived at a very early date in the year when the channel must be incredibly cold, and he survived through the rest of that day, all the following night, and for part of the following day, and they were picked up off the Cherbourg coast and off the Normandy coast and taken into Cherbourg. He was actually on an upturned lifeboat overnight, and in the morning I suppose they must have got into some overfalls. Anyway, the lifeboat tipped over again, was the right side up, but there was no bung in it, and so it was flooded. And I doubt whether by then they would have had enough energy to bail it out completely. And I believe there was something like 12 people in it originally, and bit by bit, one by one, they died. And by the time they were picked up, there were 3 men and 1 boy. This 14-year-old, he was only 15 that summer. He was a very strong swimmer, a very tough guy, and he was wearing the thickest of thick Victorian clothing. I'm sure that that must have contributed to a very large extent to his survival. To have been in, I suppose, something akin to a wetsuit for that length of time, it would be just possible to survive. But for a 14-year-old to survive, I wonder how many could today. And then to have, the story goes, the story that I heard was that after they were picked up, they went to take them back to Cherbourg. And the thing that my father, I do remember my father saying one thing, and that was that when they got to Cherbourg, the town band was there, and they were marched through the town in triumph, and he was so furious with them that he thoroughly lost his temper, and he wanted to go to bed and sleep, and that's all he wanted to do. And he says that he thinks that just because he lost his temper, that was what saved him. Otherwise, he might have just given up. I suppose everybody in all the Channel Islands must have either had a relative aboard or have known somebody aboard the Stella on that day. Something like 77 people were drowned. Well, 77 didn't survive anyway, presumably drowned.
Old Benning Arnold wrote in his diary with a certain Victorian matter-of-factness, which must surely have hidden his true feelings.
When I came home from church on Good Friday, I found a telegram from Guernsey awaiting me. It was to tell me that there'd been an accident, and I must come to Guernsey at once. I left Southampton that night. When I got to Guernsey, I learnt that my dear wife and Claude were drowned. But Benning was safe in Cherbourg. There was a boat going there in half an hour. I went by it, found my boy. He couldn't speak reasonably. Indeed, he'd been delirious and wanted to get out of the rowing boat and go and find his mother and brother. Finding it useless to press conversation, I got him into fresh clothes, and we came together back to Guernsey. When I got there, I heard Claude's body had been found just outside Alderney Harbour. I went up to Alderney next morning. Couldn't go before. Bought a plot of land in the churchyard and got a coffin made and buried the child the same day. Next day, returned to Guernsey and thence home, leaving Benning behind with children, thinking he'd be less unhappy with them than with me. In a few months, I gave up business and went to Kew to live, Benning with me. From there, he went daily to St. Paul's School at Hammersmith.
By mid-morning on Good Friday, the extent of the tragedy began to unfold. The survivors from the 4 lifeboats, cold, frightened and exhausted, were found and brought ashore by the Channel Island packets Vera and Lynx. These dramatic photographs were taken by a passenger aboard the Lynx. The French tug Moissoin brought the survivors from the 5th waterlogged boat, including young Benning Arnold, into Cherbourg at 7:30 p.m. They'd been adrift for 27 hours. London and South Western Railway's strongest competition on the Channel Islands run was the Weymouth-based Great Western Railways. The time of arrival in Guernsey for both companies was identical. It was essential to clear St. Peter Port quickly in order to secure the only comfortable berth alongside the Victoria Pier in St. Helier. Although it was suggested many times during the inquest that London and South Western Railways and Great Western Railways were racing, this was strongly denied both by seagoing officers and company representatives. However, the fact that the Board of Inquiry was unconvinced is reflected in their summing up when they recommended that London and South Western Railways and Great Western Railways boats should be timed to reach Guernsey at different hours to stop any temptation of racing. Captain Reeks took full blame. The board was highly critical of the Stella's speed in the 5 minutes preceding the disaster and described it as rashly excessive and should have been reduced by 3:15. Later at dead slow or stop. Soundings should have been taken with the lead to check the vessel's position. Because neither of these things were done, they were forced to conclude that the vessel was not navigated with proper and seamanlike care. Conflicting evidence at the time of the inquiry probably played a major role in the failure to find the Stella. Seconds before impact, it was reported that Reeks ordered harder port. Second Officer Reynolds describes the bow swinging quickly to starboard. A passenger stated that at the moment of striking, she saw rock on both sides of the Stella through the portholes in the saloon. This makes it highly unlikely that the Stella struck the Noir rock. All witnesses agree, however, that the sound of the Casquets foghorn was heard from directly above the vessel, which suggests a course much closer to the main reef. George Reynolds' assumption that the Stella was perched on a submerged reef and slid off its stern first into deep water was a fair one, considering that there was thick fog and he was totally absorbed in the launching of lifeboats during those highly traumatic minutes. The Stella did not come to rest on the reef and slide off backwards into deep water. Had that been the case, she would still be there today, and surely some passengers would have clambered onto the Casquets reef proper and alerted the lighthouse keepers. It was a neap tide, low water, and there was little wind. Passengers in the water would have only been yards from the rocks and safety. The Stella's present position suggests she drove right over the reef, and the sudden stillness was merely a deception. She was sinking in open water, and her final death plunge took place almost a kilometre from where she struck. And that's where she was found 73 years later by local divers Richard Keane and Fred Shaw.
We found the Stella when me and Richard Keane got together. We was actually looking for the Victory at the time, and we spent many of months searching, and we was going around the area with a magnetometer, and we come across an iron ship. And the first thing we identified it straight away as the Stella, which then was a great excitement because Richard was very keen on the Stella and so was I. But nobody knew where she had gone down, and so that's where we first found her.
The day we found it was a lovely day, and I dived first on this magnetic anomaly, and as I swam down, there out of the blue appeared the ship. The bow was, I landed on the bow. It was beautiful, just as though it was in harbour. Nice straight bow, lovely deck, and I sort of swam from the bow towards where the wheelhouse would be, and I went over the top of the winch, and there, lying for all to see, was the ship's bell.
All round the boat was pots, poes, plates, and even the bell, which we found, and that was up in the by the winch, was tucked under the winch, which we brought up, and that was nearly the size of a dustbin.
It's remarkable to actually find a bell on a shipwreck, and as I swam down the wreck, everything was there in place. Nothing had moved. Everything just lay where it had fallen when the wreck sank. Everything had just slowly rotted and sat there. The decks had rotted away, the wooden decks, and there exposed you could see all the pottery in what was the cabins. A beautiful sight, a sight I would never ever see again.
I don't think anybody will know how many wrecks there are, but I think I've dived on known and unknown, I think round about 70 around here, with the waters around here are terrible for the sailing ships and steamships in them days, because they never had no navigation at all, other than their own sounding weights and the horn that they blew for the fog. That's about all they had. Mostly steamships, I think, because a lot of the wooden ships get well broken up, and that's the same as the steamships. With the waters around here, they just tear them apart. And lucky for the Stella, because she's very, very deep, she stayed in good condition. And that's the only reason, because she's in quite deep water there.
We'd been led to believe she hit the black rock and sunk very shortly afterwards. And yet when we found her, she was 3/4 of a mile from the black rock, lying in more than 160 feet of water. And that's probably the reason why she wasn't found at the time. I mean, strenuous efforts were made to find the ship and find any bodies that may have been in the ship.
The Stella, she was doing about 18.5 knots at the time. I don't know what the captain was up to, because there was 2 companies at a particular time, and I think they was racing to get into Guernsey first. And it was thick fog as well. It's the people that was taken as well, wasn't it? You know, it's the amount of people that the lives was taken for, you know, it's just stupid going through fog, isn't it? And that, he must have had a reason why he wanted to go that fast, 18 knots, wasn't it? But it's when you're underwater as well and you're actually handling things, this is the bit that I feel for. You go underwater and you think that on that boat somebody's died, you know, and gone down with it, you know? And his family's still around. You can actually hold that bit of history in your hand and feel for that, you know? That's the way I feel about the boat. You've got to have a feeling, like on all historical boats and wrecks, you know?
I went back in 1994, first time for 21 years, and it was still the most amazing dive. Virtually hadn't changed at all. A few less bits of pottery and portholes lying around, but the wreck was lying perfect. But for me, in my age these days, it's a very serious deep dive, so I may never go back again.
"21 years on, John Ovenden rediscovered the Stella with a camera. She lies in about 55 meters of water, and like any good cameraman, John put his photography first. His pictures are astonishing, both in their clarity and detail, considering the depth at which the Stella lies. They're also a record, which will last long after the ravages of time bury the remains of the Stella forever.
As I went over the side of the rib and started going down towards the wreck, it was just an incredible sight as the ship started to loom up out of the gloom. But it was hard to sort of figure out what it looked like, because it was so sharp, the bow, as I actually came at it. But as it got closer, you could see the whole ship just sort of sitting there. Unbelievable sight for a ship of that age to be in such good condition. It was just mind-blowing. It just sat on the side of the ship and looked at it, where normally you'd be all over it. I just couldn't believe, you know, a ship of that age would be in such good condition. We just swam from the top of the bow right the way down to the bridge. Everything was there. The anchors were on the side of the bow. Part of the bridge was still standing upright. It was just incredible. It was a beautiful, beautiful sight. It took quite a long time to get the positions of the wreck, or an approximate position of the wreck. I knew a local diver over here, one of the leading divers, Tony Titchenden, had the positions of the ship. And being a good friend of mine, you know, I'm not normally into asking him for things like that, but I was, you know, very keen to dive this ship. So I went to see him and asked him about it, and at first he said no, he was going to keep it quiet, because a local diver in Guernsey had been diving it, Richard Keane. So I thought, well, that's fair enough, you know, it's their wreck. And then about a year later, I I was still just as keen to dive it. So I went back and I was talking to him, and I mentioned it to him again, you know, would it be possible to sort of, you know, have the position of the ship? And he said, yeah, no problem. So from then I sort of got a team of divers together, and we headed out and started searching for it. And it wasn't a nice day. It was a lot further than we'd ever been before. It was, you know, it was raining, drizzling. Everything was getting blown. The wind was blowing hard, and we searched up and down, up and down, up and down, until, you know, it took about 4 hours until we finally found what we thought was it. Every dive on the wreck is different. Sometimes we go to the wreck and we'll be there 2 hours before slack, and we just can't hook into it. She just doesn't. It gives us the feeling that she doesn't want to be dived. And then on other days we'll anchor into it first time, go down, and it's a lovely dive. Everything feels right. It's a very friendly wreck. But then on other times it isn't friendly. It just doesn't feel right. And when it's like that, you don't want to be on the ship. It gives you the very eerie feeling of diving it. And for instance, one time we'd found a little lady's shoe on the ship. We brought the shoe up to, you know, well, I had it in my jacket. I put it in, you know, on top of my inflation jacket. And when I got to the top, it'd gone. It just gave me the feeling that it wasn't meant to be coming up. It didn't want to leave where it was. It's an eerie feeling, and on certain times it's very friendly. It's strange. It isn't just me that feels that, it's all the divers. She's a deep dive. It isn't by any means an easy or a novice dive. It's something you've got to build up to over a few years. But the problem is that to do it safely and to do what a lot of clubs teach is like a no decompression dive, you only have, say, 4 minutes on the wreck. So to make it worthwhile, you have to run into what we call decompression stops, which means the longer we stay on the bottom, the longer we have to stay at, say, a set depth of 9 and 6 meters to release all the nitrogen out of our systems. So we do a bottom time of around 20 to 25 minutes, and then we do a decompression stop of an hour, which if something goes wrong at that depth and those times, we're in a lot of trouble because we're so far from help. So we try to sort of, you know, narrow all the chances of an accident down by keeping all the oxygen on board the boats, safety equipment, and everybody on the boat is trained to use the safety equipment. But if something did go wrong, I dread to think really, we do push it a little bit, and but the ship just draws us to it. It's like a magnet that keeps bringing us back year after year. The Stella's not going to last forever, and I think as a tribute to the ship and the people that died on it, it would be nice to have a permanent memorial to her and maybe bring up one of the props, put it on one of the islands, something that's going to last forever, because the sea's going to take the ship eventually. She's starting to go now. And in another 50, 100 years' time, there's going to be nothing left of her to show that she was around. It's a tough dive at the best of times, and the thing that amazes me most is that my girlfriend insists on coming down with me. I mean, it's 54 metres, and she's there every time I'm there. She's, you know, absolutely loves to dive it. If I say I'm going without her, she gets in a bit of a tiz with me, so... But just for a woman to be down at that depth is just beyond me, and the other divers that are with me just can't believe it. There's no other girls really that do dive it, and I'm just amazed she's there. Our best contact in Alderney is a diver called Fred Shaw. He's got a great knowledge of wrecks around the Alderney waters, and in Pacific, the Stella. I'd heard that he had dived it 20 years before we had actually set out looking for it. And when I went up to see him, he took us into his back room, and the room was just full of trinkets and little bits he'd had up off the wreck.
This is where I do all my pumping in here, and all the little items I find from the boats and bits and pieces I usually put around here. First of all, that's the port light from the Stella, which we found, plus the porthole. This is from the Stella. That's the steering, as you can see where the spokes went in. The steering wheel was there, and also the indication there was her last reading from the direction that she was travelling. Also, we got up here we got the log. This is the actual log that was put over from the needles to tell her distance and her travelling speed as well. That was its last reading of travel on here, and also you had a spinner coming off the back and rope to indicate your speed and distance as well. Also, there's the plate that I got out from the kitchens. We went down below and took them out, and there's quite a large amount of plates down here, and they was all stacked up still in the racks as she sunk.
There was no treasure aboard the Stella. She carried the mails, of course, but her primary function was as a passenger ship. The galley provided hot meals for passengers, dining in a sumptuously fitted saloon, and the crockery carried the combined emblems of the London and South Western Railways and the Royal Mail. Her saloon and cabin decks were covered with beautifully decorated tiles, each one numbered, and most of them still lying on the seabed with the remains of the Stella. She was among the first vessels on the Channel Islands run to carry electric light. The power came from her massive engines, but because there was no such thing as auxiliary power, when the Stella's master finished with engines, candle lamps came into action. The candle wick is still in this example. Many small artifacts representing electricity have been retrieved from the Stella, but none more fascinating perhaps than this 95-year-old light bulb with the filament still intact. It came from an exterior light casing, probably from the promenade deck. It was sealed with either rubber or putty to make it watertight. There was detritus on the light bulb before it was cleaned, and the actual bayonet socket and the light bulb connector had rotted away, so water did penetrate the casing eventually. Encased in silt and protected by 55 meters of water, it's no wonder the bulb survived. It would appear that no expense was spared on the Stella. Solid brass skylights allowed extra light into the saloons and other areas below decks. The chunky, rough-cut glass on the underside prevented the smooth surface above from acting as a magnifying glass. Even pieces of wooden furniture have survived, part of the leg of a refractory table, with the rough weather bolts still in place. The fitting can just be seen in the photograph. Yet another example of timber. The front face of perhaps a cutlery drawer, with the brass handle still in place. Both the Stella's propellers are with the wreck. Certainly an indication that she foundered well clear of the Casquets, because one propeller is broken from its shaft and is lying close by, which must have happened when she struck the seabed stern first. The loss of the Stella affected the whole of the Channel Islands. Almost everyone knew someone on board, and in a close-knit maritime community, the effects of such a tragedy are far-reaching and long-lasting. Sadly, Despite an unblemished career lasting 25 years with London and South Western Railways, blame for the loss of the Stella was laid firmly on her master's shoulders. But in the light of the inquiry, it could be justly said that there, but for the grace of God, went any one of the captains of railway steamers plying the Channel Island routes during those highly competitive and dangerous years that closed the 19th century. Suffice to say that the year after the death of the Stella, the emphasis in both the London and South Western Railways and Great Western Railways company advertising campaigns swung from speed to safety.
Qin Shi Huangdi was China's first emperor.
Now on BBC Two with Revista.
On BBC Two.